I've spent the past couple of years trying to get into Korean politics, but I find it a bit challenging for a number of reasons. First of all, I'm very familiar with American politics and some international politics, but American politics is very different in terms of where the right and left tend to fall. America, on average, is much more conservative than other countries, and it's tricky to look at other countries' politics from an American perspective. For example, in the US, almost every scientific issue becomes a political issue because the right wing basically tries to politicize everything. In Korea, for the most part, science isn't a political issue. While there are debates about what should be done about climate change and how to reduce Koreans' carbon output, there is not really a disagreement about the fact that it's happening. For reasons like the dust from China gets worse every year, mosquito season gets longer every year, the floods from rains in the summer get more and more intense. But then for a country that leans further left in general than the US, Korea is weirdly slow to go green. With regard to the pandemic, there isn't really a left-right split over the effectiveness of wearing masks. There's not a political controversy over social distancing. There are political controversies over who to let into the country during a pandemic, but that seems like a more reasonable debate to have as opposed to stuff that's going on in the US. There are also a bunch of little weird left-right differences. For example, under liberal presidents, the visa rules get stricter, which from an American's perspective doesn't quite make sense because Republican presidents crack down harder on immigration. While the housing crisis has gotten worse and worse each year, regardless of the president, for some reason Moon is getting blamed a lot more for it. People praised Moon a lot in the beginning of the pandemic for the job he was doing, but more recently his approval rating has tanked, but that seems to be more about cronyism and political corruption because of some of his political appointees and his refusal to speak out about some of that. But then you have candidates like Ahn Cheol-soo who wants to run for Seoul mayor as an independent so he can build a coalition with the Conservative Party to strengthen that coalition against the Liberal Party running in the next presidential election. I don't really get the thinking behind that, but again, these parties don't quite line up the same way they do in the US. In general, I know what happens, I just don't quite understand why all the time. A year ago, I read up on Korea's political history, basically covering all the presidents and the major legislation and reforms and all that stuff. That background's been somewhat helpful because it shows who supports who over the years. It explains people like Park Geun-hye. It also explains some of the voting habits across the country by region, but it doesn't quite give me enough context to feel like I really understand what's going on today. One thing that makes it incredibly confusing to follow what's going on in politics is the fact that political parties change their names all the time. The other thing is, unlike the US, there are like a dozen different political parties here. Less than half of that carries substantial political power, but they have representation in parliament. Still, the fact that there's a greater number of parties means that you have to pay more attention to what each party represents and all their positions on issues. Especially because with the multitude of parties, they have to form a coalition to get legislation passed. So then you have to pay attention to which parties agree with each other and why. And the frequent name changes make that a little more difficult. And it's not just parties changing names. Parties come and go. They dissolve. They form new combinations of previous parties. I admit it makes it more interesting, but it's hard to follow. Then there's the problem with following the media. Now, I primarily follow English media. However, all the major Korean newspapers do have English versions. And the style and bias of their English counterparts do match up with the reputation of their Korean versions. For example, the Chosun Ilbo is famously conservative, and some of their headlines in English are ridiculously biased. So this year, director Kim Ki-duk passed away. He was outed during the Me Too movement, but he also had like a bunch of controversies even before that. But he is still an award-winning director, an international award-winning director. So when he passed away this year from coronavirus, what did Chosun Ilbo say in English? They called him disgraced filmmaker Kim Ki-duk. Arguably, there is truth behind it, but it's such a loaded term. And that's not how you write an obituary. You're priming people about how to feel about him from the headline. This is very common with the Chosun Ilbo. The Korea Times has a mix of reporting styles and quality of reporters. Some very good, some not so much. It doesn't really seem to be a case of bias for them, more like varying levels of sophistication in reporting. The Hankyoreh newspaper has a reputation for being very leftist, and while I don't really get that sense of a bias in their reporting. I get that sense from the topics that they choose to cover. They seem to go into a certain depth that people on the left would be interested about. And as far as I follow, they don't do a lot of like pop culture reporting. Meanwhile, you have Yonhap News, which I get the sense is designed to be what CNN was supposed to be. It comes across as very neutral and also designed to create news for an international audience to understand what's going on in Korea. But at the same time, their news is so straight that it's kind of like following NPR. I don't really get a sense of the weight and the implications of the things that are going on. So as you can see, I tried to follow a number of sources to get a clearer picture of politics in Korea. If anyone has any suggestions about things I should pay attention to, or certain books I should read, or to brush up on my Korean political vocabulary so I can read certain websites, I'd appreciate any recommendations just so I can get a clearer handle on things. It would be kind of cool to make videos about political issues in Korea, but I want to be sure that I am fairly representing them. It's not enough to just regurgitate things I see or read, but I have to understand where the things I read are coming from and the implications of the things that are happening. Context is everything.